talk about presenting security metrics to your board. And they didn't ask me to do it because I'm the smartest security person in the room. In fact, I know a number of you, and I know for a fact I am not the smartest security person in the room. But I do wear a different hat at times in my life. I'm on the board of SERS, and a couple years ago I became the audit chair. So I see a lot of presentations, and I have a feeling about how presentations can or cannot work to the board. Today I'm going to talk about a special audience. There's lots of audiences that care about security metrics. Your executives obviously care a lot about security metrics. Your own team cares about it. Your IT people, lots of people care about it. But I'm going to talk about one special audience, the board, because ultimately the board is the portion of an organization that has to accept risk if they know about it. They're accepting risk even if they don't know about it. They are the ones who ultimately are going to provide the resources. So we'll talk about the metrics. We'll talk a little bit about risk and compliance. We'll talk about risk quantification, and then we're going to talk about telling a good but a short story. And so here's my premise here. Your board doesn't care so much about disaster recovery, business continuity, your controls, or all of those kinds of things. Your board cares about risk. Am I going to be in the newspapers? Am I going to lose next year's profit? So let's play a little imagination game, and let's pretend that you're the CISO at Target, or you can be at Home Depot, or you can be at Anthem, wherever you want to be, and we're going to roll the clock back a couple of years. It's 3 years ago, and you're presenting security to the board of directors. What do you wish you said, and what do you wish they'd heard? You know, in all those situations, we heard later after the fact, well, we told them to fix this and that about security, and they didn't do it. You know, they should have known, and they didn't do it. I mean, hardly ever do we hear, there but for the grace of God goes I. My company could have been in the same position. Usually we heard, well, I just wish they'd connected the dots a little better, or they should have provided me the resources. So we had to figure out a way to talk to the board. And I'm a little bit of an unusual board member because I have an information security background for the last 12 years or so. Before that in my career I didn't, and I had to learn a lot. In fact, that man back there, Kent King, taught me almost everything I know. But I'm a little bit unusual. Most board members got to the board not being an information security person. They didn't get there being an IT person. They got there because they're good at marketing, they're a lawyer, or they're a chief financial officer. So what the hell do they know about IT or information security? Not a whole lot. So we're going to have to find a way to talk to most board members and not to Nancy Edwards. Because when I played this exercise back, I did this exercise about 5 times last fall in different cities with different CISOs. And when I'd have them practice what they wanted to tell their board, I say, okay, you've got 10 minutes. Tell me what you want to tell your board. Do you know what I heard when I put on my board hat and not my Nancy Edwards used to be in security hat? Here's what I heard. Blah, 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 blah. Really worried. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, you know, wring hands. I didn't hear what they had to say because I didn't understand it as a board member. I kind of understood it as a security. So these statistics are about a year old, and I will tell you they're out of date from what I'm seeing and talking to various security people across the nation. These statistics about a year old from the Ponemon Institute said 31% of CISOs never speak with their executives. Of those who did, 23% were only doing it about once a year. And so, you know, less than 50% were having in-depth talks with their management or their board. That's going to change, and it already has changed, because when I talk to people now, they are getting to their board quite more often. And one of the reasons why is that NACD, that name in the title there, the National Association of Corporate Directors, came out with a 30-page booklet, which I have there in my briefcase, and I'm more than happy to share with anyone who wants it. They came out with a booklet last June that says, for gosh darn it, boards, You have to put information security on your agenda. And I am going to boil down 29 pages for you into 5 bullet points. Woohoo! Number 1, they say to the board, you need to understand cybersecurity, and we say information security, but they say cybersecurity. You need to understand it as enterprise risk, not just IT risk. You know, we hear a lot about all the ways that you can program incorrectly, and you can not patch correctly, and you cannot run this right, and you cannot run that right. But frankly, if your HR department doesn't get it right, or if your physical security people don't get it right, there's a lot of ways for it to go wrong that has nothing to do with your IT department. The board, please understand your legal implications. If something goes wrong, as Bill Sigline said this morning, the lawsuits start 24 hours later, and lawsuits are expensive. Next, they say to the board, get adequate cyber expertise. You know, you don't know this stuff, go get some experts and learn it. And the chances are they're going to look to you guys to learn it, their own staff first. 2 more guidelines in that 29-page booklet. Tell your management, board, this is telling the board, tell your management to establish cyber risk management with an adequate staffing and budget. So if you're in that vast majority of security people who 5 years ago say, they don't get it, they won't give me a budget, they won't do that, it's a little harder for the board to do that right now than it used to be. They're being told by their national associations that they need to pay attention to this and they need to know whether the budget's adequate. The board should have specific management discussions, and they have to get into things like avoidance, acceptance, risk transfer, or insurance. Well, you tell me, can you talk about those things in 5 minutes, once a year? No, you can't talk about all that once a year, so it's another way of saying that the presentations on information security are getting longer and more involved with the board. So what does the board want to know? Again, I'm wearing Nancy Edwards as a board member hat here. What do we want to know? We want to know the same thing from information security that we know when the marketing person comes in and says, I need a whole new program. It's really going to be great. Give me this much money and I'll give you this much return. So they want to know those same kind of questions. Well, how secure are we? How do we compare to others? What's changed? And how confident are you? So let's talk about bullet number 2 for just a second and linger there. How do we compare to others? How many know about a database that you can go to and find out how everybody else is doing security? Anybody got a great database like that? Well, good for you. I bet everybody wants to talk to you after the meeting. But for the most part, with the exception of that gentleman, those things do not exist. And when they do exist, they're not particularly reliable. So while it is always good to know what the other guy's doing, there's not a lot of great databases out there for information security, and your board needs to understand that. They are naturally going to want to understand, if you're in the hospital industry, what's the other hospital across town doing? If you're in the financial industry, what are other banks doing? What are other retail organizations doing? And by coming to meetings like this, hopefully you're gleaning some of that, and you can go back and say, I was talking to somebody at lunch hour, and here's what I found out. But be careful that you make sure your board understands that there's not GAAP accounting standards out there like there are for accounting. There's no accounting standards board that's going to be very definitive. How confident are you? Sometimes what the most important thing you can say to a board is, there's a closet there, I haven't opened the door, I don't know what's behind it. I have no reason to think there's something horrible behind it, but I don't know. I don't know is an acceptable answer. So you want to be as confident about what you know, and you want to be confident about what you don't know. You don't want to pretend to know more than you do. So what do board metrics look like? They're thorough. They represent your entire risk landscape. They're clear. What risk is the board accepting? If I see anything more incorrect in a board presentation, it's not getting a clear ask. Gee, this is what we can't fix, and we need you to understand that, board. Or this is what we'll fix in 2 years from now, according to our roadmap, and this is what I need you to understand. rigorous external standards, whether you're using PCI or NIST or whatever. But I think I would want to know as a board member that you're using some external standards and to facilitate decisions. That's another way of saying what I just said a moment ago. What do you need from the board? What are you asking for? Another person? Are you asking for money for a certain technology? Are you asking us just to understand that we've got legacy architecture here that's not going away for a long time, and the legacy architecture has this ouchiness about it, so let's understand it. So think about those things. And on the, as you prepare that presentation, go get a friend. Again, you're going to talk to the board now. And remember what I said about a board member. They don't generally look like you. They don't have an IT background. They don't live in your world. Go get a senior exec that's presented to the board before and has their confidence or knows what seems to work there, and test your message. A common person to try is your CFO or your general counsel. Those are people who are not IT people. They generally have presentations to the board, or sometimes they're members of the board. And you can use that person to test your message for your content, your tone, and your length. Length is another issue. You generally don't get a lot of time. I'm going to speak for 45 minutes today, and I'm probably going to be pressed up till 45 minutes to get this out. And I'm only talking in general about information security. You guys are living with a big environment. If you think about ISO and all the chapters of it and all the things that you have to go, what the heck are you going to pick out to tell the board? It's going to have to be the right things. Common presentation mistakes. I've taken those young ladies and men from the 60s and 50s and their cute little suits are true. In my experience, another way of saying it is glad-handing or too glib. I've seen people come to the board and they feel like, oh, this is my career maker or breaker, so I have to say that everything is okay in my department, everything's going well, and we do all the right things and everything's right. If that's true, I think that's wonderful, and that's really what you ought to say to the board. But I think quite often we're all struggling with a certain issue or not, so being too glib isn't all that helpful, because the board, they all have real day jobs too, and they have problems in their day job. On the other hand, there's the too much FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the aspect of just sowing seeds of, my God, I'm worried, and then it comes across as almost like the most important department in the company is information security, and as much as we might like to think about that, the sales and marketing people would probably argue with us just a little bit. Too much detail goes to the too much time and the lacking comparisons to other. Remember, that's that double-edged sword that I keep talking about. Everybody wants to know how they compare to others, but there's not good data. So if you don't address the elephant in the room of people wanting to know how do we compare to others, they're going to wonder, why aren't you talking about that? I want to know about it. But if you come across as too definitive that I know we're doing the right thing because somebody else is doing that, that's probably one of the worst risk management decisions you can make, because you've not really assessed that other organization and you don't know if they've made their risk decisions good or great. The board cares about compliance. If I've seen one time, I've seen a million, or if I had a nickel for every time people have said, security is not compliance, I believe it. And I believe that to be true. It is true. We all know that's true. That doesn't mean the board doesn't care about compliance. It doesn't mean that it's not important. Most compliance has merit. Somebody drew up a rule for a reason, or they wrote a law because something rotten happened and they said there ought to be a law, and so they wrote it up. So compliance comes in a lot of different flavors, from law, regulation, common practice, and all those kind of things, and the consequences can vary from fines and judgments all the way to grounds for a civil suit. So, somebody tells you you're not compliant, a lawyer's going to really like hearing that. And we all know that the winner of all litigation is always predetermined. It's the lawyers. And really, their children deserve to go to Harvard, but why on your dime? Don't send them on your dime. So compliance is important, and if you're going to take the risk of not being compliant, do that with real open eyes and with lots of people sitting out on that limb together with you, because if a breach happens afterwards and you're not compliant, you just look utterly stupid. And that's never a good position to be in. So at the end of the day, your board needs to know that an incident can happen to the very best. As I've seen in other presentations today, some of the security spend is shifting over from prevention to what are we going to do about it if it happens? And that's entirely appropriate. So an incident can happen to the best person, the best company, the best organization, but your job is to contain the frequency and the severity, and to be confident that, again, you're not sitting out on that limb all by yourself knowing about something that's happened or something that could happen, and you haven't shared it appropriately with the people who need to accept the risk. Let me talk about that aspect of needing to share it with people just from one other aspect, and kind of judging from my experience as a former security officer type of lady. The last thing that you want to have happen is that you're making a presentation to the board, and the board member's in the elevator later with somebody from your team, or maybe the database administrator from IT, and they go, well, we just heard this presentation and we heard XYZ needs to be fixed. And that person starts looking at their shoes thinking, oh, that's not the half of it. You know, your database administrator, the quiet people in your IT department, reach out to them and make sure that you run your presentation by them too. Because A, you want them to be on board with you, that you've got your priorities right, and they may have a different take on it that you need to hear. And it will just help your organization altogether if your whole team is on board, not only in the security area, but in the IT practical areas for the presentation. So I think I just talked to this slide a little bit. How you build the metrics matters. You are going to present a few metrics. You're going to choose which ones are important and which ones need to be talked about at that time. There's going to be transparency among your team. Hopefully it incorporates a lot of people's thoughts. And then this last thing, let's talk about this a little bit, rigorous thinking. I think I went to a presentation earlier today and they were talking about CMM, capability maturity models. Those are really important. They help make you think rigorously and logically about what you're doing. I haven't seen a lot of CMMs that are focused exactly on all the different domains of information security, but creating your own isn't that hard. You've got the basic CMM model from Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. Just go ahead and use it. And I've seen it done before for incident response and for various things. And then you can set a goal for yourself. Not every organization wants to get to level 5 and then thinks it's too expensive. Lots of organizations definitely want to get to level 3 and probably to level 4. Are you going to do it in 12 months? Probably not. So that goes back to that first point there. Create a 5-year roadmap for your security. You're going to probably update that 5-year roadmap once a year, but get a 5-year roadmap together that encompasses all the domains of security, is rigorous in its thinking and thinking about a capability maturity model, and then you've got a good handle on risk, and you can pick and choose among those things as to what you want to tell your board. Remember, I told you earlier in the presentation that the board and CISO interactions are increasing. As I started a series of presentations last fall, it was changing even there, where people were telling me that, hey, 6 months ago I talked to the board once a year, now it's once a quarter, and the one person said, they moved my office to the executive level. Now I can't go down the hall to the bathroom without the president shaking me on the shoulders and asking me a question. So the boards are very different than they were 18 months ago. Between the National Association of Corporate Directors and all the newsprint, and there's a lot of stuff going on in Congress too, saying you can't forget about information security. You can't just delegate that to somebody. The board has to care about that because too much can happen to your corporation. What did Target lose? They lost a year's worth of profit. How many times would they bet a year's worth of profits on anything else? If the facilities guy came in and said, we're going to build a building, I think we could lease one just as well, but no, we're going to build it. And then they find out later they could have leased it and saved a year's worth of profit. How would that have gone over? So you've got risks in information security that might be a year's worth of profit if you can get there and talk about that. So let's talk about risk quantification, because when people come to the board, the facilities guys got numbers, the CFO's got numbers, the marketing person's got numbers, but a lot of times the information security person's got words. And then sometimes those words aren't as persuasive as the numbers. So think about this bald tire, and maybe that's the risk you're facing is a bald tire, and how much risk is there. Well, if this is what you're going to use the bald tire for, I don't really think the risk is very significant. So quantifying the risk is easy to say. You're going to estimate frequency and magnitude. How often is this bad thing going to happen? How bad is it going to be when it does happen? And maybe predict a range for that and calculate a range of outcomes. Well, maybe none of you are mathematicians and statisticians, but it really isn't that hard. You're going to want to value accuracy over precision. You don't want to be precisely wrong. You don't want to be number C up there. The C example is precisely wrong. They got very precise, but it's wrong. We'd all love to be D, but if we can't be D, go ahead and be B. So your risk is quantified. Well, now what do? You hopefully are going to compare your range of outcomes to the company's risk tolerance. Let me say that one more time because it's really important. You're going to compare the range of outcomes to the company's risk tolerance. How many know what their risk tolerance is? I just talked about the idea that Target lost a whole year's worth of profit dealing with an information security thing, and I'm not sure that they're done calculating what the impact of is to Target of their breach. But that's a year's worth of stuff. What are you going to do? Does your company know what they're willing to risk? Are you willing to risk $100,000? So if the event could cost your company $100,000, maybe you say to yourself, yeah, that's got some merit to be fixed, but we can wait a little bit. Maybe it's $500,000. Maybe it's $1 million. Maybe it's $25 million. I don't know the size of your organization or its risk tolerance, but those are the kind of numbers that the board's going to think about, that your CFO thinks about, and that's where you're hopefully can translate your chance of a breach, your chance of some kind of lousy outcome because of information security, and turn it into some numbers. Before we get to Red Riding Hood, I want to talk about a particular tool that I think is really good in the risk quantification area, and that is FAIR. FAIR was developed by a guy who worked at Nationwide, Jack Jones. A lot of people in this room probably know Jack Jones or know of him. I think his tool is easy to use, and it will take that frequency and severity that you might guess at and turn it into some numbers that other people can understand. So it uses two basic statistic things, and it buries those things in there so you don't have to be a statistician. It uses Bayesian inference, and that is a complicated statistical words that means something very simple, that it's going to adjust the probability of something happened because you already know something else happened. So if you know this, given this, what's the probability of that? And that's all that does. And then a Monte Carlo analysis sounds really exotic, and I'd love to go to Monte Carlo, but all it is running thousands of trials of the same thing. So when you run thousands of trials, you generally find out that there's an example of something way up here and a big cluster that looks like, you know, the Milky Way, and then some cluster of things down here. So if you think about a breach of credentials in your company, what usually happens? Oh, just about nothing. But occasionally, maybe a server gets infected, and that costs you a lot of time and money to fix that server, but not overwhelming, so it's not something you're going to report. but occasionally that multiplies into all these cascading set of events and something really lousy happens. You can see that on a Monte Carlo analysis. So while I was talking there, you've probably had a chance to see that Red Riding Hood is on her way to Grandma's house, and her cakes and cookies have been supplemented by Social Security numbers and credit cards. So she's really got a good basket of goodies there. How many do not know the story of Red Riding Hood? I thought I would get an audience that was, you know, had good literature background, and indeed. So here we come back to the board, and what does the board need to know? Maybe the board doesn't need to know about Red Riding Hood at all. Maybe there's some other story we need to hear, because Red Riding Hood is a done deal. We all know what happened, and it's good. Well, but maybe in this story, Red Riding Hood saved by the woodsman. She and Grandma are saved by the woodsman, but maybe the next time one woodsman won't be enough, and we need 2 or 3 woodsmen. So maybe that's your story. Just cut to the chase. We don't really need to know that Red Riding Hood and Grandma got in trouble because she was fished. Who knew that long before we used the term fish, that he asked her where she was going, and she answered very nicely she was going to Grandma's house. So he took the shortcut to Grandma's, and poor Grandma ended up in his tummy. So, you know, all these things have been happening for thousands of years. If you read your Bible, you know that people have been conning each other for thousands of years. There's nothing new there. But the moral of the story here from presenting board metrics to the board of directors is that you're only going to have a short time. You need to pick the stories where you have a clear ask for the board. You want the board to give you an extra person, another woodsman to keep the wolf from doing bad things. You need the board to accept the risk that I don't care, the wolf's going to get in there anyway, and we're going to have to accept that risk. We're going to do this when the wolf attacks, and we're going to respond. You need to decide what it is, because you're only going to have a precious half an hour, 45 minutes. Maybe you're going to get an hour. I used to get, in the old days, Dave, Todd, I see is in the audience, and he succeeded me at State Auto. Dave, in the old days, I would get 10 minutes once a year to present to the board. Pretty hard to tell people who have no information security background what they need to know in 10 minutes, but somehow you've got to boil it down and do your very best. So tell a good but a short story, and practice that story with people who aren't in information security. Vet that story with people who are deep into information security and IT, and make sure your story's thorough and rigorous, and give it a try. I've got plenty of war stories about presenting board metrics, but what questions can I answer for you? Yes, Brian?
Just really a comment. Anybody that's using Gartner, they have a thing called IT Score. It'll score your CMM against risk management and information security. It's very obscure, it's hard to find, but it's a really good way to get comparisons to others and against your industry.
Gartner is a great tool if you can afford them. How many people are Gartner members? Oh, good, 2/3 of the room. So that's a good deal. What other questions do we have, or discussions, or any war stories you want to share? Colleen?
Nancy, how do you compare what you prefer to tell the board versus what you might tell your officers, such as your CFO, your president?
I think it's more a matter of time and degree. You're generally going to, the lower the audience, the more time you can take with them, the different background they have. So as you move up the organization, your executives may be very much like your board. They may have no background and they may need just this much, but they may need a lot more too. And I think the other difference between an executive and a board member is that as you implement things in information security, maybe new password rules, always ever popular, maybe new things that people can't do on their computer any longer because it's insecure. They can't download to this, or they can't do this, or they can't do that. as you do that, the executives have to live with those rules. So sometimes I think you need to spend a little bit of more time with your executives so that they will support what needs to happen in the organization. Or they can tell you, you know what, that may be real important for security, but we can't spend that money. If we don't get out there and get this new product out, our competitors are eating our lunch and we won't have a company to protect. So I grew up in a family with 8 children, and sometimes all of us needed new shoes. It's September, we're all going to school, we all need new shoes, and 8 children, we're not all going to get new shoes. That just was it. And so you have to learn to figure out that, you know, maybe this year it's not my turn to get new shoes, and I'll take the hand-me-downs or just squeeze my feet into what I've been wearing and do what's that. So, but you want the board to make the decision with full disclosure. If they're going to choose not to fund your department, you're not going to say this in a vindictive way. You're not going to say, gosh, you'll be sorry if you don't listen to me, or, you know, anything like that. And that's why I think reducing it to numbers to say that on an average 10-year basis, that's what a fair analysis or that Monte Carlo can do for you, is that on a 10-year basis, something like this can cost the company $100,000 a year on average. Most years it'll be 0. One year it'll be $1 million, and on the average over 10 years it's $100,000 a year. Is that a risk the board wants to accept? And if the answer is yes, then you go back and do what you can. Here's one of my war stories. We needed a logging system. Kent, I'm going to tweak you one more time a little bit. When Kent and I worked together, he said, gosh, you guys don't know what's going on. And all roads with Kent, I always kidded him, led to logging, and he was absolutely right. So I thought that management really wouldn't understand the acronym SIM, so I said, we need a new logging system, and we need a logging system. And I would say it over and over. I found out a couple of years into that what the CEO heard was, we need a new login system. You know how you put your user ID and password in? It was like, holy moly, Nancy, you weren't being clear at all. You know, nobody understood what I was talking about. So, a lesson learned on my part. Yes, sir.
Just a tip to share I found helpful. When you're asked the question, how secure are we? It's a good opportunity to set expectations by answering the question by saying, if a company is 100% secure, they're 0% functional. So you'll always be less than 100% secure. And then it's about managing the risk and finding ways to be resistant against the attacks. And they seem to understand that.
That's 100% right. You can't be 100% secure. It just doesn't work. Or in the insurance industry, I worked on the operational side, and you know, if you only accept the very best drivers, you don't have a company. You know, there's lots of people out there with tickets and accidents. You're going to have to find a way to insure them, and you're going to have to find a way to live with risk. Another mantra that I always like, and I think is helpful in this situation, is risks are endless, resources are not. So it's another way of you're going to have to make decisions. The risks are endless, the resources are not. So choose your priorities. Yes, sir.
Are boards starting to get used to the velocity of change in this space? Hey, you were just here last year asking for stuff.
No. I think that's something he asked. Our board's getting used to the aspect of how fast change occurs. Sometimes I think I don't even get used to how fast technology is changing. You get used to one type of system, and all of a sudden you're protecting something else, or the configurations have changed again. So I think that's one of those context setting things that you might need to say. They know that their little phone has changed a lot, and all of a sudden all the board members are really excited about having their iPads in front of them instead of, you know, having a bunch of paper, and they're signing into board sites to get their information and stuff. But the idea that technology is changing as quick as it is, and what was a good solution 18 months ago now needs an update, probably going to need to level set with them and remind them just a little bit in 10 words or less. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any tips on what your materials should look like, slides, etc., to complement the message that you're sending?
How should the slides look? As simple as possible. I think you're going to have to pick 3 to 4 points that you want to make. And it could be that you get a board member that's had something happen at his or her corporation that makes them want to ask something else. Well, I would say have confidence in yourself that you know your whole security landscape and you'll be ready to answer that question orally. Or if you want to have a hidden slide, you can have a hidden slide. But I would say you pick 3 or 4 points and make those points. A heat chart is always good, but I will tell you that I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth with respect to a heat chart. Sometimes heat charts look more official than they are, because some heat charts are based on going red, yellow, green, and there's not enough numbers behind them. Why is this one yellow and this one green? How many yellows add up to make a red? I don't know about you, but they just didn't teach that in the math classes. I do not know how to multiply a green times a yellow. And so many of these things interact. So heat chart is something that works. I think it distills complicated information down to a picture, but the heat chart has to have some numbers and rigor behind it. And I truly believe that's very, very important. So what your metrics and your board presentation looks like is going to vary according to what message you're getting and what your board's receptive to doing. So one person grabbed me in the hall this morning and they said, well, I'm going to the board once a month now, and I get an hour, but the board has no background in information security, so they're spending the hour kind of teaching a little bit about information security. And I think that that's good, although there comes a time when you have to have a clear ask. And if I see anything that's probably a mistake, it's that people spend a lot of time educating and talking around the issue and don't end up with a clear ask. I need you to accept risk. I need this much in resources. I'm going to get this far this year, and I won't get this far until 2 years from now. So, anything else I can bore you with? Yes, sir.
So, how do you balance? Because I know that for a lot of us, your resource trap. So, you're trying to say in 1 year or in 2 years, you're going to be a certain place, but you can't get there without having that. That resource would be there for you to drive that. So how do you then deal with that?
I go back to risks are endless, resources are not. So, that kind of mantra you probably teach your board. So, this is another way of saying that same thing to your board is, I can get this far with the resources I have. More progress will require more resources. So to your example, I can't get this done this year because we've got to maintain what we have. And I think another story that goes back to your question about how quickly technology is changing is sometimes we're working very, very hard in information security just to stay in place and not fall behind. And that takes a lot of work because you're doing all this stuff to figure out what's going on, from what's your logging system telling you, and how is identity and access management changing, and how are people figuring out stuff around it. So just the general stuff that you deal with takes a lot of resources. So if you've got something where you're saying to yourself, I think this needs to be funded by the company, and the company's going, geez, I just don't have that money in my pocket. I can't give that to you this year. Just say, well, great, this is the progress that we can make now. More progress will require more resources, and this is the risk level we have. I think it's a hard message to deliver. I'm being kind of glib myself, a sin I told you not to make. I'm being a little bit glib myself because it is a hard message. It's easy for me to say that risks are endless, resources are not, but when you're in front of a board, they want answers. And they're very smart people. They didn't get to the board without being very smart people who think ahead, you know, and take what you're saying, and they've already leaped forward 3 slides, and they're there on you. So they're very smart people, but they're just not experienced in your field. So you just probably sometimes need to come back and say, well, sir, you know, I respect what you're saying, and perhaps this is not the year that I get that resource allocation. This is the risk the company faces. So again, let's go back to the beginning and imagine that you're the target CISO and the clock's been rewound to 3 years ago, and you have your once a year 10 minutes in front of the board. What do you wish you said, and what do you wish they heard? Because it sure didn't turn out very well, did it? Did not. Yes, sir?
With the board having usual duty to the shareholders, to maximize shareholder value, would you recommend that part of the presentation should kind of focus on the impacts to the shareholder value? So should we maybe involve the CFO in preparing that message?
Yeah, I think that one slide I said, you know, involve your CFO or general counsel. They're great audiences because they don't have IT background, and yet they sit on the board to hear your presentation. Tell me the first part of your question again, though. I lost my track.
Yeah, so she would somehow incorporate the impact, potential impact of shareholder value if certain risks.
Right. Right. And again, I think that'll come down to knowing your board, how often you're there, how well educated they are about information security. And a lot of times they're not. But if you go into too many stories about Target, Home Depot, Anthem, fill in the blanks, you won't have time to say your other stuff. So maybe just a level set to say, you've probably seen in the news that Home Depot, Target, whatever, have had these rotten consequences. A lot of times, how many people have ever been asked right after one of those things hit the headlines, could that happen to us? And the answer is yes. And we're doing our very best to be ready to respond and discover that situation quickly should it happen to us. That's another message the board needs to understand. I think I said it in one of the slides, but let me reemphasize it. The board needs to understand something can happen to your organization. You're going to try and reduce the frequency. You're going to try and reduce the severity. And maybe the other guy that hit the front headlines of the newspaper didn't do everything that they should. We're not here to judge them. We didn't live in their environment or anything else like that. But we sure know we don't want to be in the headlines of the paper, and we sure know we don't want to lose a year's worth of profit. So knowing that those things can happen, here's the situation for our company, and here's what risks that we have, and here's the top 5 things, maybe the top 3 things that I recommend doing about them. And then if the board asks more questions, then you pull your 5-year plan out and you demonstrate to them that you've tied it to a capability maturity model and you've used rigorous thinking. But do they want to know all that right at the beginning of your presentation? Probably not. Probably not. Again, people are different, and the minute you try and generalize about something like the word people, Nancy Edwards doesn't know every board and who they're composed of and things like that. So I'm trying to give you some general things to think about. But the basic idea is you're going to have very limited time. You have an audience that doesn't look like you and doesn't have your background. So somehow you've got to translate your words into words that they understand. Believe me, things like SIM and logging don't work. They don't work. I learned the hard way. They don't work. Anything else on let me give you one more piece of advice. If you think you're going to be presenting to the board or presenting to your executives or even to the people in the IT department, maybe you're going to be a guest speaker at the IT town hall meeting or something like that. One of the best things that you can do for your career is to join Toastmasters. A lot of people don't like public speaking, and sometimes there have been tongue-in-cheek polls that say people would rather die than get in front of an audience and do public speaking. But it's a very useful skill to have, and Toastmasters as an organization is so helpful and so supportive, and I participated in Toastmasters for many years. I don't think I'm the best public speaker there ever was, but I'm not scared of it any longer. And in your career, public speaking can be a very important thing to convey risk. If people are going to understand risk, if you say run, fire, they get it. But maybe when you're saying we need a SIM because we're not logging all the information from all the systems, maybe eyes are glazing over. We're going to have to find different words than that to get resources. Yes, sir?
You say run fire, it means run fire. You say it's critical, it means critical. Did you guys work something like that?
I would say that on the board I'm on, that's still evolving. Enterprise risk management is still a new thing there, and they're still getting to where they want to be. And unfortunately for them, they have this board member that's really interested and involved in that. But I would say that, you're going to have to figure it out for your own organization, what that taxonomy is. But generally speaking, you're going to have to take the IT words and turn them into something simple, something simpler. The system could crash. We could be out of, unable to serve our customers for 48 hours. Somebody referenced earlier in an earlier presentation, maybe it was Bill Sigline this morning, about business continuity and the business impact analysis. That has a nice way of reducing for the different departments in the organization that I guess I can afford to be out for a week. I wouldn't like it. My customers wouldn't like it. But if we were out for a week, the sun would come up tomorrow. So we don't have to spend a zillion billion dollars to have instant recoverability. So maybe some of those business impact things of when you talk to various places in the organization can give you a taxonomy for your organization. Well, the great thing is that happy hour is next, and I want you all to know that drinks are on me. So, so get a treat and have a drink, and I'll be there. And I just love to talk about this topic, and I'll be glad to melt your ears even more. Thank you very much.